I'm Lemore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today, we have a special guest, Zhang Yanshuo. She is the Assistant Professor of Asian Languages and Literatures at Pomona College. She grew up in Sichuan, in Chengdu. She encountered lots of Shaoshuminzu, ethnic minorities, during her youth, and she did her PhD at Stanford University working on issues related to ethnic minorities. First off, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with the audience. Yeah.
I think before we jump into a discussion of your research, when I was reading up on your research, I encountered this really cool poem that you have done some research on. It's on a Qiang ethnic minority reed pipe. Would you mind if we discuss this poem?
Yes, sure. Let's get started with the discussion of this poem.
Are you okay reading the Chinese version of the poem?
Yes, I'll read the Chinese version and then you will read the English translation. This poem is called Liangzhou Ci, the lyrics of Liangzhou, written in the Tang Dynasty. And it goes like this in Chinese. 黄河远上白云间，一片孤城万仞山。羌笛何须怨杨柳，春风不度玉门关. And that's it.
Here's my translation of it. The yellow river from its source comes out of the white clouds, a plain of lonely guard towers, mountains 100,000 feet high. With the Qiang people's reed pipe, what need is there to complain about the willows not sprouting? The spring wind cannot pass the jade gate. Tell me a little bit about the history of this poem. You mentioned it's a Tang Dynasty poem. Why is this poem so interesting?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up this poem. So indeed, the Tang Dynasty was a very important period of Chinese history in which there was a lot of interethnic exchanges. The Qiang was actually used in the Tang Dynasty to refer to a bunch of ethnic groups that were residing in the western borderlands of China. So the Jade Gate that was mentioned in the last line of the poem, 玉门关, sometimes it's also translated as the Jade Gate Barrier. So it's basically a military outpost. And there were a lot of ethnic others, the so-called ethnic others that were active in that region of China. And the Jade Gate Post presently, it's located in the Gansu province, which is in northwest China. This is also a very important region that connected China with regions in other parts of Asia. And it was an important site on the Silk Road. There were lots of inter-ethnic exchanges and sometimes even warfare among different groups of people. And the particular poet, Wang Zhihuan, who wrote this poem, was kind of imagining the scenario, the natural landscape that was surrounding this area. The mighty Yellow River was running around the area, and we have this feeling of a very high fortress that was kind of isolated in the deserted area. But even though visually it might look deserted, culturally it's a very rich place for interethnic exchanges. And so I think this poem is very interesting, and it's really representative of how many different times the Qiang actually popped up in Chinese culture and history, from the ancient times all the way to the present days.
A couple of questions for you. So we talked about the Yumen Gate. Is that near Yumen City? Like there's a city today in Gansu called Yumen. Those are corresponding, right?
Great question. So I think one interesting thing about place names in China is that sometimes we get a lot of historical overlaps. For example, one unrelated case is the Shangri-La region of Yunnan province. We know that the name Shangri-La really came from this Buddhist idea of a pure land, and it was made popular by the novelist, the Lost Horizon, right? James Hill, I think that was his name. So similarly, there are a lot of historical myths surrounding other certain names and place names in Chinese culture. So I have yet to look into the actual history of the name of the Yumen Guan city, but my guess is that it's very likely that this very name, Yumen Guan city or Yumen Guan Shi, might have derived from this poem. And we can look into that history of how literary texts leave their imprints on places and the identities of places. And that's still a very powerful trope that you will see in a lot of Chinese places, especially in the age of ethnic branding, place-based and cultural economy and tourism. So there has been a lot of interplay between literature as texts and place identities, and place names. So I think that's one interesting feature about contemporary Chinese culture.
And wherever it happens to be in Gansu, is it fair to say that poets in the Tang and in other eras regarded this as the end of kind of civilization? That Jade Gate, Yumenguan, is kind of on one side you have the civilized world, on the other side it's this kind of other space. Is that fair to say?
That's a great point. So I think actually there were sometimes competing views on where civilization ended in classical Chinese texts. For example, on the one hand, if you look at classical Chinese literature, there was a sense of Nism-centered view of the world, right? So Confucian texts and Confucian moral economy would be kind of the center of Tianxia, of all under heaven. So that's one sentiment. But on the other hand, some other texts in classical Chinese literature actually made active references to civilizations that were beyond sort of the boundaries of China. So one text that I actually love reading and teaching is called Hou Han Shu, the Book of Later Han, and it was composed by a Confucian scholar whose name was Fan Ye. So he wrote about the many civilizations that were in active conversation with Chinese civilization, kind of in the borderlands of China. So Hou Han Shu, the Book of Later Han, had a lot of very interesting depictions, for example, of Persian culture, Indian culture, how Indian jewels and spices were imported to China, how treasures from Persia were imported to China, and vice versa. And a moment ago, I mentioned about the Silk Road. Many of us know that the Silk Road kind of connected China to other parts of Asia and even Europe. So the Silk Road went as far west as Rome. And in Hou Han Shu, the Book of Later Han, there were some chapters that were directly about Rome. And interestingly, Rome was called Da Qing, which meant the big Qing. We know that Qing is the first empire, imperial dynasty of Chinese history, right? And then interestingly, Fan Ye, the author of the book that I mentioned, he used Great Qing to refer to the people of Rome, because in his mind, people of Rome were like very tall and generous, and they produced rich cultural productions that were comparable to what China was producing at the time. So I think that's all like to say that there were many acknowledgements of those different civilizations that lie outside of China, but the so-called borderlands, such as the Yumenguan, actually served as important gateways and passages to connect China with those different civilizations of the world. And I think that's one very fascinating aspect about the borderland, which is that it's not a place of cultural abandonment or anything like that, but it was, to the country of popular imagination, it's very much a place of connecting cultures, connecting civilizations and countries.
Some authors would have seen it as a kind of a line in the sand, but other authors would have been much more open to kind of the connections that are happening around Jade Gate. Is that right?
I would say so. And there's even some different versions of the same poem that we just recited together. For example, some scholars render it as Huanghe, the Yellow River, and some versions had it as Huangsha, Yellow Sand. Right? I think that's probably because in traditional China, sometimes the manuscripts were circulated differently with different commentaries, and sometimes the calligraphy might have meant different things to different people. So all that is to say, literature inherently lends itself well to different cultural interpretations. And that opens up the doors to a fascinating world of intercultural exchanges. Mm-hmm. I think that's one thing that interests me the most, is this interconnection between literature and reality, or fact and fiction, which is to say that a lot of things that we see as historical fact, lead reality, has its roots or have their roots in literary imagination. So that interplay between fact and fiction is what makes the study of literature and culture so interesting to me.
You mentioned that some versions of this poem don't talk about the Yellow River, they talk about the yellow sand. So the first line in this poem, the Yellow River from its source comes out of the white clouds. I interpreted the Yellow River because the Yellow River plays such an important role in Chinese geography and China's understanding of itself. So if you're suggesting that some of these versions, tell me if I'm wrong, some of these versions refer not to the Yellow River, but to the yellow sand, that seems incredible to me because I was thinking it was this image, we have this image starting out of this very Chinese geographical feature coming out of this very much a borderland area. But what you're suggesting is there are multiple ways to read this poem and there are multiple versions of it. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. So when you mentioned about the Yellow River being this important source of Chinese civilization, I think it makes sense to rely on the first version of interpretation, which is that the Yellow River comes out from the white clouds. And that's true, right? We know that the Yellow River actually originates from the Tibetan Plateau, which is the highest place in China. In Qinghai province, the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, the two biggest, most important rivers of China, both originate from the western borderland province of Qinghai in the Tibetan Plateau, right? So in that sense, it's this line of the Yellow River deriving from high above the clouds is a reference to the high altitude of the rivers, but also a reference, I think, already to the intercultural influence shaping what we know as Chinese culture today. It's incredible to think that those sources or cradles of Chinese civilization actually already have some ethnic origins at the very beginning, even geographically speaking, right? It comes from the Tibetan Plateau and flows throughout China. So I think this is very fascinating. And you're absolutely right in pointing out that when we read those kinds of literature, we should pay attention to what's going on there and the textual nuances. And even different versions, I think, really give us an idea of how things might have worked, what might have been on the minds of the producers of that kind of literature, and not just the producers, because there were also transmitters, people who helped spread those kinds of literature throughout Chinese history, the commentators and the people who were all part and parcel of this production of literature. So I would like to think of literature as not just a moment of writing and reading, but also this whole realm of production and consumption and constructing cultural imaginaries and cultural imagination. Yeah.
So when I first read those two lines, the Yellow River from its source comes out of the white clouds, a plain of lonely guard towers, mountains 100,000 feet high. It seems like this very stark image. I mean, the lonely guard towers suggest to me something. There's a hint of a threat there. I mean, obviously, guard towers don't exist in peaceful areas, and you have the Yellow River coming through this. The Yellow River is the cradle of Chinese civilization coming out of these borderlands that are peopled by ethnically othered people. How you're reading this poem, it sounds like, is you're seeing it as this kind of mingling of two separate cultures to make a single unified culture of under the Tang state, which is, it's not only fascinating because I think too often we read China as this monolithic whole that is one thing, and that's not at all accurate, especially during the Tang Dynasty when this is being written. You have multiple groups, ethnic groups mixing to create a multi-ethnic civilization.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Of course, there were also conflicts and warfare between different groups of people at the time, as much as our current world has seen many different conflicts. But that doesn't mean that we need to write off the otherwise fascinating history of also intercultural exchanges and mingling. So I think mingling is underappreciated. Actually, when you read other poems produced in the Tang Dynasty, for example, this semester I'm teaching a course called China from the Borderland at Pomona College. So we spend the whole semester reading this kind of literature. And I ask my students, how do you interpret it? How do you put it back to the historical context? Especially because today we have so many ideas about those groups. How do we really try to contextualize what happened in history? From the very beginning, Chinese culture has never been this monolithic homogeneous entity, but it has always been shaped by many different cultures and ethnicities.
Can I ask, so your research is particularly focused on the Qiang people, an ethnic group today that exist in China, but that have this long history, or at least the word Qiang has this long history. That's referenced in line 3 of this poem. Who are the Qiang?
Who are the Qiang? That's a great question.
If you can just sum up an entire people in a single paragraph, that would be great.
So who are the Qiang? So that's a great question, and that's a historically and culturally relevant question. So what I discuss in my book is this historicized understanding of the Qiang. I resist the temptation to define it in a very neat, categorical way. Rather, I put the Qiang back to the historical context in which it has occurred and look at the Qiang as a changing category of not just people and ethnicity, but also China's relationship with the world around it. That's what I define the Qiang as. And there's a lot you can glean from that long history. And we just discussed a lot about the Tang Dynasty definition of the Qiang, which was this borderland people in the western region of China. And it was not just one group, but it was a generic term that was used in the Tang Dynasty to refer to a lot of different ethnic groups together. But of course, this term changed. And one other important moment to understand the history of the Qiang is in the 20th century, of course. That's when the Qiang has become recognized as an ethnic minority, a 少数民族 in the People's Republic of China. That's another important moment of the history of the Qiang. So now if you go to Sichuan province, where I grew up, you would encounter people who call themselves Qiangzu, and they are mostly in the Baba Tibetan and Qiang Autonomous Prefecture of Sichuan province, and they are one of the main ethnic minority groups of Sichuan. And now if you go to the Qiangzu regions, you'll encounter them, the Qiang villagers. I did a lot of ethnographic field work in the villages of Sichuan, and I got to mingle with local people. It was a very nice, fascinating experience. And like other 少数民族 of China, they have their own distinctive style, their clothing style, their songs, their dances, and many other things.
You mentioned that the word Qiang was used to discuss lots of different ethnic groups. And then you have the sort of PRC recognition of Qiang. Is there a clear line we can draw from the Qiang people mentioned in this poem and the Qiang people that we recognize as the Qiang today?
Literature, again, helps preserve some of the identity markers of the Qiang. This is not to say that the historical Qiang is the same as the current Qiang, right? They are two very different things, which I talked about in my book. But I think if we do look at literature and those external symbols of ethnicity or ethnic identity markers, they do exist, right? For example, nowadays, if you go to the Qiang regions of Sichuan, you will see Qiangdi, the Qiang reed pipe, has been elevated as an important symbol of Qiang cultural identity. So if you go to the tourist villages, you will see local people playing the Qiang reed pipe, Qiangdi, and sometimes you can even buy them, and they are very elaborately made. And actually nowadays, the Qiang people draw a connection between Tang Dynasty poems and the current cultural economy of promoting certain ethnic symbols. That's a very fascinating thing that you can discern in terms of how literature gives recognition to those cultural symbols and external cultural symbols.
So can I ask you, the Qiang people are written about in poems like the one that we read today by Han Chinese authors, and they talk like the Qiang ethnic group's reed pipe is an important symbol for Chinese poets talking about this ethnic Qiang people. But these poems aren't being written by Qiang people, right? But today, with the Qiang ethnic group, they are now reading these poems and incorporating this 1,500, 1,600-year-old tradition into their ethnic thinking about themselves. So they're constructing their own personal identity by how another group has constructed them a millennium and a half ago. Is that right?
Not only that, but that has been a very important strand of ethnic identity construction in contemporary China that has absolutely a lot of power in terms of the Qiang people imagine their historical identity in China. So I think you're right in that, yes, historically, at least what we know as the Qiangzu today, they don't have a written script. They have a very distinct oral language, but they don't have a written script. So chances are that the poetic traces that we read in Chinese literature were actually written by the Confucian or Han Chinese scholars and writers. But it's true that the Qiangzu today, they're making that active connection to connect their identity with what occurred in Chinese literature, right, in the classical times. That historical continuity is very important for the contemporary Qiangzu to imagine their place in Chinese civilization. Right. So I think historian Paul Cohen has written about historical consciousness being very important to the making of the identity for a particular group of people. Right. So I think making that connection to classical Chinese poetry has been actually a very important strand of contemporary Qiangzu's construction of their identity. And it has powerful consequences on the minority peoples of China today in terms of seeing their place as part and parcel of Chinese national identity and cultural identity from a long time ago, and also to have those clear and tangible symbols of culture that they can in turn brand and present to tourists, to others who come into this region. So I think it's almost like both a culturally but also an economically driven claim of identity. And interestingly, again, we see the role of literature and texts, poetry playing a role in this whole process. Literature is not just a set of texts that we read that's written by very famous writers, but it also plays a role in the cultural imagination of people, and it can be mobilized to shape the identities of minority groups or even majority groups, not only in China, but maybe in many other parts of the world too.
So it gestures towards this idea of mingling that you were talking about, that this group who is being written about before, suddenly they're consuming that, and that writing about them that we can see as separate from them and as distinct from them maybe is suddenly becoming a part of their tradition. And it really, I think it connects to this mingling that we've been talking about. There's a film called Nanook of the North that's on the Inuit Eskimos. It's a 1922 American silent film about the Inuit, and it has been discussed in terms of like how it others the Inuit. But in fact, today, if you go to the Inuit, some of them are like, we really love this film. We think of it as like a part of our heritage because it preserves that heritage. It sounds like something similar is happening with the Qiang and this kind of how the Qiang flute that's featured in this poem has become a part of Qiang tradition because they're encountering it as they're consuming more Chinese media, that is Chinese poetry, all kinds of Chinese media here. They're incorporating that into how they think about themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I have yet to watch the film that you mentioned, but I do believe that there are similar motifs and moves made by other minority groups and indigenous groups of the world in terms of making that historical connection. And this is very powerful because some of those groups were probably written as or probably portrayed as the so-called barbarians, people who lacked a certain type of culture or civilization. But then now by making those connections, they're really reclaiming their identities, they're reimagining their identities. And that's very powerful, right? So we're talking about the power of literary imagination in terms of fostering connections and really helping those people to make new forms of identity that were probably not available to them in the past, because now they have access to this vast, rich repertoire of literature that does not just belong to the people who produce them, but like we mentioned before, the process of consuming them, of mobilizing them are also important. So I think that also taps into the realm of maybe global literature and transnational literature of how certain cultural symbols, right, they can leave their place of origin and take on new lives and new forms. And those are all indigenous peoples, minority groups are all making use of those mobile cultural tropes.
You mentioned indigenous groups. Your research has focused on bringing some thinking about indigeneity from a sort of North American theoretical sphere and applying it to Chinese cases in a way that, could you explain more about the sort of broader move you're trying to make in terms of your research with indigeneity?
I think I was first inspired to think about the Qiang as an indigenous group when I was in the field interacting with them in different villages. For example, one time when I was visiting a village in Sichuan, it was a very late evening and I was having dinner with the locals, and all of a sudden they brought up this topic of the so-called poisonous cat. So the idea of the poisonous cat in Chinese is called 毒药猫, right? It's a widely circulated myth in the Qiang regions, which means that local people believe that certain women can have this enchanting power, both enchanting but also destructive power over others, especially the people that they didn't like. So local people really believe, they told me in very vivid details that one time such and such person went to somebody's house and they were served a bowl of rice and then they got sick the day after, and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of beliefs of those almost supernatural and maybe in the modern eyes of people unscientific ideas of how people, especially women's identities, can be constructed. So I was like, this is a very interesting dimension of the Qiang culture that you don't tend to read from books, right? So, but then it does exist and does have powerful influence on local people's ideas of who they are. So tracing from that encounter, I started to do more research about the so-called poisonous cat. It turns out that from a sociological perspective, it's similar to, for example, what happened in the United States in terms of the witch hunt movement at the beginning of the American history of scapegoating certain members of a community when you can't find an explanation for a disaster or something. So then I was asking myself, how can we account for this very fascinating dimension of ethnic identity? It's a very locally derived part of their identity, and the Qiang are still very much under the influence of that indigenous source of identity. And then similarly, the Qiang communities also have a strong shamanistic tradition. Shamans are called shibi in the local communities, and the shibi were historically male elderlies of villages, and they were like healers of local community, and they would be invited to important social occasions like weddings and funerals and so on and so forth. So they were always there to bless the people. So, and then that's a very, again, locally derived dimension of the Qiang identity that you don't tend to read a lot from formal literature or books, but then it has a very important role in shaping local Qiang people's idea of who they are and in fostering community ethics and morality and community ethos. So then I started to theorize about this idea of indigeneity by paying attention to some of the discourses or ideas that might lie outside of our modern ideas of what is science, what is reason. As a scholar, I don't want to pose judgments about whether or not those beliefs are scientifically based or not, but I think I'm more interested in looking at how those ideas, those indigenous ideas and beliefs are like gluing powers for the local people. So I think in that realm, I'm also switching out a little bit from the realm of literature and more into the role of an anthropologist or maybe even a sociologist in terms of looking at certain tokens and ideas of ethnicity. And I think this is very important because we all know that, for example, Native Americans also have a very strong spiritual and shamanistic tradition. So that's where I want to bring my understanding of the Qiang and maybe even some other 少数民族 of China into the conversation with worldwide indigenous identities and indigenous cultural traditions. And I think that would probably constitute one of the important directions of my future research. And I'm really excited about it.
The way you're framing your project, it sounds very interdisciplinary to me. Can I ask, How do you connect the diverse fields of anthropology, literature, and cultural studies together? Those seem like separate fields, but it sounds like you're trying to bring them together.
Mm-hmm. When I was a graduate student at Stanford University, I was fortunate to have been able to take classes from many different fields and departments. For example, I was a PhD student in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, but I also took classes from the Department of Anthropology and also art history and history. So I think when I was taking those courses and also thinking about my research subject, one thing that had occurred to me was how narratives were constructed across disciplines. So I think one thing that ties together those different fields is how a story is told and how a story is constructed. Traditionally, scholars in Chinese literature or literature departments might rely heavily on published works of certain writers and poets and novelists and so on and so forth. To me, that was an important part of my work. But at the same time, one question I asked myself was the Qiang and many other 少数民族 of China today, they are still actively creating their cultures. So it's not like, okay, we're talking about a great 19th century author that has already passed away, right? We're talking about a group of living people. So that to me had to deal with issues pertaining to anthropology, sociology, and social issues. So that's when I felt like an interdisciplinary methodology or interdisciplinary framework would have been very important to me. And I did embark on that interdisciplinary approach. So like I mentioned earlier, I went into the villages, stayed with locals, and heard a lot of stories, collected a lot of oral histories from the people that I stayed with. And then I started to look at the patterns of their narratives and the stories that I was being told by my informants or interrogators. Sometimes anthropologists call it an interrogator. They're not just passively answering your question, right? They're also negotiating something in the process of being interviewed. So anyways, I think that it was very important for me to look at the multiple dimensions of narratives, both in written literature, published literature, but also oral discourses, oral literature, everyday encounters. And to me, that is one central tenet that helps me connect literature as a discipline with anthropology and to a degree history. So that has been a very rewarding experience, and I'm really excited to work in this field and to push the boundaries of literature and anthropology and the humanities by hopefully being able to contribute somehow to the new discussions that will happen in those different fields.
Your research takes these studies and turns them and gives the Qiang more of a voice in the discourse?
I would say so, yes. So I look at the literature, in addition to looking at classical Chinese literature, I also look at contemporary literary works produced by the Qiangzu writers, fiction, autobiography, and also cinema. I also look at art, cinema, and also the built environment, how a tourist village has been visually constructed to lure tourists, so on and so forth. So really, I'm looking at the whole realm of the production of discourses in the material world, in the textual world, and in the cultural world. So to me, that is the most fascinating and enriching dimension of my own work that I hope I would be able to convey to others.
I think this is a good place to end it. We've had such a fascinating discussion. I look forward to your book. You're at Pomona College, Zhang Yanshuo. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and helping me better understand the Qiang, this cool poem, and in general, Qiang literature as a broader space for exploration.
Thank you so much for having me today.
It's been a joy.
Thank you.
I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.